water and fire, earth and air. Today we will enter these elements. We will enter them, and perhaps we will come out transformed. I'm Jay Leeming, and this is the Crane Bag Podcast. Today we are going to explore the green and thunderous forest of a Russian story known as the Firebird. And in this story we may find a wild wrestling match between the forces of freedom and the forces of limitation. Thank you for joining me. Let us begin. Once there was a forest of wild trees flourishing up into the air, a forest in the brightness of summer. Once there was a forest, and inside this forest there was a horse. And on the back of this horse there was a hunter. And horse and hunter went through that forest. Now this hunter, well, he served a king. A king far away in a castle made from stones cut from the earth. And this king wanted things, and so did his lords and his ladies, and this hunter was the man to find these things. And on this day, he was seeking deer, he was seeking meat, he was seeking perhaps a boar or an elk, food for the lords and ladies of that palace. For the hunter was a man to seek and to find one thread in the tapestry of creation and cut it short. Well, this hunter, who knows how long he traveled through this forest on his horse. But there came a moment when he saw before him on the path a red feather. A red feather. It seemed to glow. It seemed to be made out of fire itself. So he got off his horse and he knelt down beside that feather. He had never seen a feather so large and so beautiful, so filled with the shimmering qualities of fire, of the sun and the stars. And then behind him there came a voice, and it was the voice of his horse. A talking horse? Yes, a talking horse. For this story takes place in the time when horses could still speak. Or perhaps simply it takes place in the time when we still had the capacity to listen. And the horse said, "Do not pick up that feather. If you pick up that feather, you will come to know what trouble is." Now the hunter thought about this. He took in the words of the horse. But he also remembered the wealth of the king who he served. He thought of the storerooms of that palace, and of the gold and the silver he had seen in that palace, the great wealth there. He thought of the many lands the king owned. And he thought to himself, if I bring the king this feather, this marvelous and magical feather, he will reward me. So the hunter picked up that feather, put it into the pocket of his coat, got on his horse, and turned around to go back to the castle. Well, he went through that forest on the back of that horse, and around him the birds sang, and the wind filled those trees with a beautiful whispering, roaring, whispering sound. And at length he came to the village, and at length he came to the palace itself. And he went to the door, and people took his horse away to the stable. And the hunter walked confidently through the hallways of that place of power until he came to the throne room itself, a room named for the throne, for that is the most important thing in it, and the one who sits there, the king, is the important one. And the hunter walked across the tiled floor of that throne room to the throne itself, and he knelt before the king. And he pulled that red, shimmering golden orange yellow, wildly bursting with light feather out of his jacket, and he put it down on the floor before the throne. And he knelt down, and he said, "Your Majesty, today I have brought you food not simply for the body but for the soul. I have brought something beyond anything I have seen before. Look at this feather. I found this in the forest. It glows, it glimmers, it shimmers with an unearthly, magical light. Truly, a king such as you deserves to have a feather such as this." The king looked at the feather. His eyes grew wide. The feather did seem to shimmer. It seemed alive there in the throne room. It seemed like its light would almost illuminate that entire room if it was given the chance. And the king said, "You have done well. You have done well. I am pleased with this feather. It is a marvelous and magical thing. I believe it comes from the Firebird itself. A bird I heard about when I was a child. My grandmother would sing to me the stories of the great Firebird who blazes through this world. No one knows where to find this bird, but perhaps this is from that bird. Perhaps we can find it. Perhaps you can find it, my dear hunter. In fact, I require of you that you bring me now not simply another feather, but the bird itself, the bird entire, the whole thing. Yes, you must do this for me within 3 days, or else I will have the royal executioner cut your head from your shoulders, and you will sleep beneath the ground and know the sweet air of this earth no more." "I will do this," said the hunter. And with his head hanging low, he turned from the throne and from the king and walked out of the palace. Well, he could have gone to the bar. He could have gone home and slept. He could have found his way to drink or to despair, but instead he went to the stable, the royal stable, and there was his horse. With its chocolate dark eyes, he went to that horse with his head hanging down, with sorrow in his heart. And his horse said, "What is troubling you, my dear hunter?" And the hunter told him. He told his horse how he had brought the feather of the Firebird to the king, but now the king had amplified his desires, increased the stakes, and now the king desired the entire Firebird itself. And the horse said, "Do not sorrow over this, my friend. This is not trouble. Real trouble is yet to come. What you must do is return to the king and ask him for 3 bags of grain. Bring these to the stable tomorrow morning, and early, before the sun rises, you and I will set out." "All right," said the hunter. So he went to the king, and he got 3 bags of grain. And that night the hunter slept, as the king slept, as the horse slept, as the entire kingdom slept, and the stars pulled down their light from the distant beyonds and sprinkled it and showered it down upon the world. And in the morning the hunter awoke and went to the stable with the 3 sacks of grain, and he and his horse left that stable and rode out into the forest. Well, they rode for a short time, or perhaps for a long time. It is hard to say. It might have taken minutes, it might have taken years. For stories move in the waters of eternity. They fill our body, they swim around us, and who is to say where we enter the story and where we come out? But it is certain to say, when we exit a story, we are different than when we went in. And so this hunter, different now in a strange and mysterious way, rode that horse back into the forest. And it was dark. It was dark, but there was starlight there in the air. And the horse took the hunter to a clearing in that forest. And And then he came to a stop. And he told the hunter to spread the grain through the grasses of that field. The hunter did this, and then the horse and the hunter went and hid behind some trees. And they waited. The birds began to sing. There was a blue glow in the eastern sky, and it seemed the sun would soon rise. But suddenly there came a wild whispering sound, and a great light was in the air, a blaze of light, and they saw the Firebird go overhead over the field and off to the west, and then it circled around and came back and came to that field and spiraled down and down and down and finally came to rest in a blaze of light in that clearing in the forest. And the Firebird began to eat the grain spread there among the grasses. And the horse wasted no time. The horse jumped out and took one of its hooves and stomped down on one of the wings of the Firebird, pinning it to the earth there. And the Firebird shrieked and sang and shrieked, and the hunter grabbed the net, and he came running out, and he threw the net over the Firebird, just like this, and wrestled that Firebird this way and that, and got it inside that net. And then the hunter got on the horse and put the Firebird on his back as the sun rose and spread its golden light through the forest. And the two of them turned and went through the forest towards the castle. Well, they came to the village, they came to the castle, and the horse was taken away to the stable. And the hunter walked confidently through the hallways of that castle with the great net on his back, and inside that net there was this blaze of feathers and talons and beak and sharp eyes, which was the Firebird itself. Like a second sun there on his back, its light shining and glimmering in the walls of that castle. And then the hunter came to the throne room, and he went before the king, and he stopped. And he held the net there, and he said, "Your Majesty, you see, I have brought the Firebird to you. For you, in your royalty, in your greatness, deserve to be in the company of such a wild and blazing bird as this." "Yes," said the king, "yes, well done." The Firebird shrieked and sang for a moment and then was silent, looking around, looking at the walls, looking at the glimmer of its own light on the tiles below, as if imprisoned there. And the king said again, "You have done well. Excellent. You have proven yourself someone who can get strange and mysterious things from this world and bring them here to my presence." And the king called for 2 guards, and they came, and they took the Firebird in the net. And they took it out of that throne room and into the palace garden. And there in that garden was a large iron cage. And they put the Firebird in that cage, and they closed the door. And the Firebird looked out at them with its star-bright eyes. And meanwhile, in the throne room, the king was speaking. And he said, "Yes, you have done well. This is a beautiful thing. I deserve to have this in my kingdom. But now there is something even greater than this which I desire, which I have long desired. You have proven yourself worthy of this task. What I require is this. I want you to go to the edge of this world and find Vasilisa the Beautiful. I want you to find her and bring her here to this throne room, for I require a queen, and she shall be my queen. You must do this within 3 days. Or else I will have your head cut from your shoulders, and you will sleep in the dark earth with the bones and the roots and the old stones." "I will do this," said the hunter. "I will do this." And he turned, with his head down, with sorrow in his heart, and he left that throne room and went off towards the stable. And there was his horse. His wise horse was there, with the brown fur around it, with the brown hide there, with its deep chocolate eyes. And the hunter had his head down, and sorrow was in his heart at the doom, the fate that was before him. And the horse said, "Hunter, why are you so sad?" And the hunter told him, told him how now the king desired something more, desired that Vasilisa the Beautiful be brought from the edge of the world back to the kingdom, back to that very throne room. And the horse said, "Do not sorrow over this. This is not trouble. Real trouble is still to come. What you must do is this. Go to the king and say that you require a beautiful tent, the most beautiful tent that he has. And then ask for 3 bottles of wine, the strongest, most magical wine in his possession. Gather these things, and tomorrow come to the stable early, and you and I will set out." "Thank you, O horse," said the hunter. And he went back to the king, and he requested these things, and he was given them. And that night darkness fell, and the hunter slept, and the king slept, and the horse slept as well. And in the morning early, the hunter went to the stable with the tent, with the 3 bottles of magical wine. And he got on his horse, and they left that castle and went out into the forest. Who knows how long they traveled? All day they heard the singing songs of the birds. They heard the twitterings of insects. They journeyed through that forest until they came to some hills. They journeyed through those hills until they came to mountains. They crossed those mountains and they came to a scrub land, a desert-like place. It could have taken years, it could have taken moments. Long enough for your elbows to knock against the walls, long enough for the train to arrive, long enough for you to fall in love and out again and back in love a second time, long enough for the song to be sung and the bear to turn over in his sleep, the great bear whose eyes are the stars. That's how long it took. That's how short it took. A fly coughed, and a moment later they heard a great roaring sound. A roaring, whispering, laughing, crashing sound. And ahead of them they saw the sea. And they went along the shore of that sea. And then the hunter found a good place, and he pitched that tent there in the sand. This tent was beautiful, made of silk. It was of many colors. Yes, beautiful purples and reds, colors like a dawn, like a sunrise, and colors like a sunset as well, and colors like the blazing of the sun at the height of the sky. All these different colors were in that resplendent, radiant tent. And he spread a blanket out inside that tent, and he put the 3 bottles of strong, very strong wine in that tent. And then the horse hid in some grasses, and the hunter went to the doorway of that tent, and he sat down. And he began to sing. And he looked far off, and he saw a glimmer of light on the waves. And that glimmer became closer. It came closer, and he saw that it was a golden boat. And on that golden boat there was a woman with long hair rippling in the wind. And the boat was coming closer, and she was looking at the shore, and still the hunter sang. And that boat got closer still until it came to the shore. And there that boat stopped. And Vasilisa the Beautiful stepped from that boat into the sand, and she walked towards the hunter. And the 2 of them looked at each other, and they spoke the golden words, the first words of meeting, like the first light of the sun when it comes over the rim of the world. And they laughed. And then he invited her into the tent, and they sat down in that tent, and they began to drink the wine there from the bottles. And they began to tell each other stories. And the hunter told Vasilisa the Beautiful his own story, where he had come from, where the roots of his being were, where the leaves of his ambition are, how they fluttered in the wind of possibility. And she spoke as well, and she told her story of the troughs of the waves and the crests of the waves and the far reaches of the distant sea. So they laughed and they sang and they told stories, and after a while, Vasilisa the Beautiful fell asleep. And in that moment, the hunter did not pause. He did not reflect. He simply wrapped her up in a blanket and carried her to his horse. And he put her sleeping body on the back of his horse, and he packed up that tent. And he got on his horse, and he and the horse and Vasilisa the Beautiful left that roaring sea and headed back to the palace. And they left that laughing, crashing sea behind, and went through swamplands and scrublands, and they went over the mountains and through the hills, and they entered the forest once more, passing by the place where the Firebird had been caught, passing by the place on the trail where he had first seen the feather of that Firebird. He remembered the spark of that moment, and then he cast it aside. And through the rushing, whispering trees they went, over the roots and the moss and the stones which are the memory and the stories of this earth. And before long, after an elbow of time had passed, after a great mile of time had passed, after a mountain of time or a teacup of sandy little moments that drift away and are caught in your shoes went by, after all these things happened, after a short time or a long time, they came to the palace once more. And the horse was led away to the stable, and the hunter carried the sleeping body of Vasilisa the Beautiful in through the hallways of that palace. People murmured as they saw him walking, "Who is that? What is that? Who is that?" And then he came to the great throne room there, still glimmering, it seemed, with the brightness of the Firebird's presence there. And he walked towards the throne, and he laid Vasilisa the Beautiful down there, sleeping in her blanket at the feet of the king. And the king's eyes opened wide. "You have done it! You have done this! It is Vasilisa the Beautiful!" "Yes, sire," said the hunter. "I have brought you Vasilisa the Beautiful." And in this moment, Vasilisa's eyes flickered open, and she blinked once, twice, 3 times. She looked around. She saw where she was. She saw where she was. And she said, "What? Where am I? What has happened?" And she sat up. And the hunter said, dear lady, I have brought you from your realm, from your world." "Yes, you have," she said. "I was at peace there. I was at home on the sea. What is this place?" And the king said, "Do not be angry, dear lady. This hunter brought you here under my orders. For I require a queen, and long have I heard of you and your wisdom and your power and your beauty. And so I have required him to bring you here because, my dear, I seek a wife, and you shall be that wife. What do you say? If you agree to it, you and I can be married, and then we will rule this kingdom as king and queen." Well, she took stock of the situation. She looked at this king. She saw the spears on the walls. She saw the torches burning there. She saw the wealth and power around her. She saw the hunter there. And she spoke and said, "King, I will marry you. I will become your queen. I will become the queen of this kingdom. But I require something before we are married, my dear. I require something. And that is my wedding dress." "Well," said the king, "we can make that happen. Where is this wedding dress?" "Well," she said, "it's not far, but it's under a rock, and that rock is at the bottom of the sea. Bring me this dress, or else I will marry no one." "Hunter," said the king, "you must solve this. You can solve this. You are the seeker, the finder of things. Return to the sea, obtain her wedding dress, the wedding dress of Vasilisa the Beautiful, from the bottom of the sea, and bring it back here. Or else, well, your head shall be cut from your shoulders, and you will live to sing and dance no more." "Yes, your majesty," said the hunter. And sadly he turned and walked out of that throne room and to the stable. And there was his horse, there amid the hay and the animal smells, there amid the wood beams with slants of light coming through between those beams. Chewing on some hay, there was the horse. And the hunter went to him, and with his head down, and with his capacity to listen, or with the horse's capacity to speak, somehow it happened that the horse said, "What is troubling you, my dear hunter?" And the hunter told him what now he was required to do, how one task had been added to another, and now finally he must return to the sea and get the wedding dress of Vasilisa the Beautiful from a rock under at the bottom of the sea. And the horse said, "Do not sorrow, hunter. This is not trouble. Real trouble is still to come. Tomorrow, come here down to the stable, and you and I will set out early." So the hunter agreed to this. And he went off and he slept, and Vasilisa slept, and the king slept, and the entire kingdom slept, as darkness covered the world. And the stars blazed in the sky in their ancient patterns up there, telling the stories of fire and light down to the sleeping earth, so those stories might enter our dreams. And the next morning early the hunter went to the stable, and he got on his horse, and they set out. And they left that palace behind, that palace made from stones, taken from the earth, from the mountains of this world. And they entered the wild forest, passing by once again the clearing where the Firebird had been caught, passing by once again the trail where the hunter had first found the feather of the Firebird, though this time he did not notice these things, but simply passed them by. Across the swampy places, they went over the hills, they went over the large, tall mountains, they went through the scrublands, and they returned to that roaring great sound of the sea. They returned to the sea itself. And they came to the sand, and there the hunter got off his horse. And the horse instructed the hunter in what to do. And the two of them went to some tall grasses and waited, hiding inside those grasses. And the sea laughed and sang and cursed and told its story to the sand. And suddenly there came a great frothing and watery noise from the sea, and a great crab crawled out of the sea and into the sand. And as the crab came out onto the sand, the horse wasted no time, but jumped forward and took one of its hooves and brought it down on top of the shell of the crab. And he said, "Crab, aha, we desire something." And the crab said, "Mercy, mercy, mercy." And the horse said, "Crab, we need the wedding dress of Vasilisa the Beautiful. It is under a rock at the bottom of the sea. You must get this for us." "Mercy, mercy," said the crab, "I will do this thing for you." "Yes," said the horse, "but you must swear. You must swear to do this, or I will not let you go. I will crush your shell." And the crab said, "I swear. I swear upon the mother of the sea herself. I will obtain this wedding dress for you." "Good," said the horse. And he pulled his hoof back, and then the crab spoke in a wild, splintery language, a language that sounded like broken shells and dishes being tumbled over in the surf. A wild mathematical babble of a language. He spoke into the air, and suddenly 100 crabs came out of the sea and scuttled onto the shore and gathered around that particular large crab with his big green claw. And he spoke to them in the crab language. a language of whispers and clatterings and twitterings and the cracking of knuckles of the waves of the sea. He spoke in that language, and all the crabs then turned, and they went into the sea. And there was a great frothing and bubbling of that sea, and down they went to the very depths. And the horse and the hunter, they waited there on the shore. And some time later, a few salty moments later, the crabs came back. And this time they were carrying the great wedding dress of Vasilisa the Beautiful. A wedding dress like a waterfall itself, as though it were made from the place where water and stone argue and tumble and wrestle and talk to each other in that way. A wedding dress that seemed to be made out of spilled starlight and the milk of the moon itself. Beautiful, sparkling dress. And they brought this dress to the horse and laid it down on the sand at the hunter's feet. And the hunter said, "Thank you, O crabs. Thank you, O crabs." And the crabs bowed, and they went scuttling back into the waters of the sea. And the hunter picked up that dress, put it on the back of his horse, got on his horse, and he turned and set out. And they left those waters behind them and galloped across the sand. And they galloped across the hilly places and up into the mountains and over those mountains and down into the valleys beyond. And then they entered the wild forest. And they went through this forest as the birds sang. As the birds sang and the deer went scurrying away from the sound of the hooves of that horse. And the wind spoke in old mysteries in the laughter of those trees. And then, finally, the hunter and the horse returned to the palace. And some servants took the horse away to the stable. And the hunter went, carrying the beautiful wedding dress, through the hallways of that castle and to the throne room itself. And there was the king on his throne, and beside him on another throne was Vasilisa the Beautiful. And the hunter knelt down and laid that wedding dress down on the floor in a beautiful way. And he said, "Your Majesty, my dear lady, here is the wedding dress of Vasilisa the Beautiful." "Ah," said the king, "you have done well." "Yes," said Vasilisa, "you have done well." "And now, my dear," said the king, "now shall we be married?" And Vasilisa said, "Well, we shall be married, king. Yes, we shall be married, that is a certainty. But I require one last thing before that ceremony is to take place. I require one thing, and it is that this man who stole me from my watery realm and brought me here to this castle, that this man be thrown into a cauldron of boiling water. That is what I require. When that is done, you and I can be married." "Very well," said the king, "very well. Hunter, prepare yourself. Guards!" And he called for the guards, and they came, and they took hold of the hunter roughly on both sides. And the hunter said, "Wait, wait, wait!" And the guards said, "No, we're taking you." And the king said, "Take him away." And they dragged him away from that throne room, and down a clanky hallway, and down some stairs, to the darkest place of that castle, the bottomest, dungeoniest place. They went to the dungeon. And they went down a dark hallway and into a dark room, and there were bones on the floor from prisoners who had died in that room. And there were rusty chains on the wall, and they tied up the hunter there against the wall, fastened him amid those chains, so he was dangling against the wall, and they closed the door, and they left. And so the hunter was in darkness. This hunter who had seen the glimmering light of that feather on the trail, and snatched it up. That brightness, though he remembered that brightness as he was there in the darkness, and all that had led to. Did he sleep? Something like sleep happened to him. And before he knew it, the door opened, and it was morning, and the guards were there. And they took him from the wall, they unlocked him from those chains, and they carried him up the steps of the castle, and they went to the throne room, and the king said, "Out, out into the courtyard," and they went to a courtyard of that castle where the sun was streaming down, and there was a cauldron on a great fire, and the water inside was boiling, the bubbles were popping, the steam was rising from those great waters. And the guards began to take him towards the cauldron, and then the hunter said, "Wait, wait, wait, I have one last request." And the king said, All right then, what is your request? I would like, please, to say goodbye to my horse before I am killed. I have no one in this world. No one. I just have that horse. I wish to say goodbye to my dear horse before I am killed. All right, said the king. And the hunter was taken away by the guards to the stable, and there was his horse. And the hunter, as he had so often done before, he went to that horse, and he lowered his head down, and there was sorrow in his heart. And the horse said, "What is troubling you?" And the hunter told him all that was happening. He told him how now he was about to be thrown into a cauldron of boiling water. And the horse said, "You may sorrow now, for this is real trouble." And the tears trickled down the cheeks of the hunter, and he wept. And then the horse said, "But when they take you to this cauldron, don't let them throw you in. Instead, you should break away from these guards and run and leap into the cauldron yourself. That is what you must do, and there might be some magic in this which might save you." And the guards came forward, and they grabbed hold of the hunter. "Thank you, O horse," he said. "Goodbye, thank you, goodbye." And they dragged him away from that stable, dragged him away through the palace and to the courtyard. And there was the king, and there was Vasilisa the Beautiful beside him, and there was the cauldron filled with seething, twisted, boiling water. And they began to take him to that cauldron, which was red hot. And as they did so, the hunter suddenly broke free, and he took 2 mighty steps. 1, 2, and he leapt into the air, and he splashed down into those waters. Bam! Just like that. And he went under the waters, completely buried by the watery element. And the waters frothed and boiled. The steam rose. Everyone gasped. "What is happening? What is happening?" And the fire crackled beneath that cauldron, and inside he was writhing this way and that. And suddenly everyone looked and marveled, because 2 fresh, clean hands went out and grabbed the edge of that cauldron from the inside. And a moment later, the hunter leapt out of that cauldron and stood dripping on the tiles of that courtyard. And he looked resplendent. His eyes were bright with fire, like the Firebird itself, and his hair seemed darker and more luminous. His whole body seemed stronger. His heart seemed wiser and more compassionate. He was like some kind of glimmering god. And Vasilisa said, "Who are you?" And he said, "I am the hunter. I have gone into the elements of water and fire, and I have returned." And the king said, "He is a god now. There is magic in this cauldron. There is magic there. Now, if a lowly hunter can be turned into a great being like this, what will happen to me? Yes, king of noble birth that I am. If I go into these waters, I will come out as an emperor of this entire cosmos. Yes, servants, throw me in." The servants looked at him. "Your Majesty?" "Yes, throw me into those waters. Yes, those magical waters. I desire the change." "Your Majesty, it's boiling water." "Do it," he said. "Do it, or you shall be killed." The servants went forward, gingerly, cautiously, and then they took hold of the king, and they began to carry him across the stones towards the cauldron. "Throw me in," he said, and the servants took him to that cauldron, and they threw him down into those waters. And the waters seethed and boiled around the king, and the steam rose, and the fire crackled, and everyone gasped, and they watched. And the waters roiled and twisted and turned, but no hands came out of those waters. They waited. They waited some more. The fire crackled, the bubbles popped on the surface of that water, the steam rose up into the air. Nothing, nothing. Then finally one of the ministers came forward, and a servant. They looked inside. One of them got a large wooden stick. They took another stick, and they fished the body of that king out, and they dumped it onto the tiles like a bunch of wet rags. He was red all over. His eyes were closed. He was gray and red and burned and boiled, and there was no life in his body. And everyone gasped and wondered at this. And Vasilisa said, "The king is no more. He must be buried. Servants, bury the king. And you, hunter, you shall be my king, for I am the queen of this realm now. You and I shall rule this kingdom as king and queen, and we will rule it with wisdom and with kindness and with generosity." Everyone was astounded, but they took the body of the king off, and they buried him in the ground, and they sang the old songs over the body of that king. And that day there was a wedding. For everything had been prepared. The musicians were there, the food was ready in the banquet hall, and the magical words were said, binding the hunter and Vasilisa the Beautiful together so they would make one rope to haul up the mysteries of the other world into this world, quite possibly, perhaps. And there was laughter, and there was singing, and there was a great feast in that castle afterwards. And the birds sang, and the people sang, and the people sang like the birds, and the birds sang perhaps like the people. And there were toasts, and there was roast swan, and breads, and cakes, and beautiful things happened, and other people fell in love, and there were arguments, and dreams were spoken of, and they went riffling away into the air, and they vanished. And many old things happened for the first time, and many new things happened like they'd happened for 1,000 years, over and over again. And amid the laughter and the frolicking of this feast, the hunter had a thought, and he remembered the sight of that burning, red, glimmering feather on the path of the forest. And with a glance at Vasilisa the Beautiful, he took her hand, and he whispered something to her, and then the two of them stood up from the feasting hall, and walked through the hallways of the palace out into the palace garden. They had wine glasses in their hands. They were laughing. And they took their wine glasses and put them on a stone bench, and they walked to the center of the garden. And there was the iron cage, and inside the iron cage was the Firebird. The blaze of its feathers not so bright any more, but its eyes burned like they were two stars, two hot coals from a fire at the start of this universe. Those two eyes looked at the hunter, and the hunter looked at the eyes of the Firebird. And then he reached out. He unlocked the door of that cage and opened it wide. The Firebird looked at the hunter for one last time, and then went frolicking, flashing out into the air and up into the sky and away. And no one knows where that bird has gone. One red feather. You can see it there on the forest floor, shimmering, bright, beautiful. A feather the color of fire, glimmering. In this place where there's leaves and branches, a place where there is not fire, or where fire is not really supposed to be. Fire is opposed to those things in some ways. Fire, the glimmering feather. See it there in your mind. And the hunter is there. Does he pick it up, or does he not? I first heard this story in my 20s. Heard it from Michael Meade, the American storyteller from the Seattle area. I heard it on a cassette tape. And I was very taken with that image of the feather, the giant feather on the forest floor. And now it's other things which grab me. But as always, dear listener, I would say find what calls you in this story. Don't take my word for it. Go into the story as if the story is water. We need our brains, we need our minds to figure this thing out. But images are the quickest way in. We want to get in that water. Later on, we'll pull out the sonar, we'll pull out the maps, we'll see how deep the water is, we'll talk about hydrogen and oxygen. But right now, we just want to get wet and swim in the waters of this story. So I invite you to do so by choosing an image from the story which grabs hold of you. It's as if the story is a landscape. Where does it feel right for you to stand? It doesn't mean it's a moment you like. It could be a moment that bugs you. Some image in the story. As if it were a dream that someone had had, that a civilization, a culture had had. Where in that dream do you want to be? Where does it feel right for you to be? So turn me off if you have to. I'm just a voice. Well, I'm more than a voice. I'm definitely more than a voice, but yeah, turn me off and consider perhaps. What image in the story grabs hold of you? Woman at the edge of the sea, Firebird in the air, the castle, the cauldron of boiling water, the wedding, the feast, the forest itself. What is it that calls to you? The hunter picks up that feather. And like I say, I love that moment. He does what the horse tells him not to do. The horse says, don't pick up that feather, that's trouble. Do we do that? Well, perhaps, listener, you have done that. Perhaps I have done that. Don't open that door. Don't go over there. But we go over there. But we open that door. In some ways, this is the last choice he makes in the story. After this, it's just one long train ride, train wreck, one long journey of demands put upon him by the king. And when he picks up that feather, he's thinking of what he wants. He's thinking of the wealth of the king, and hoping some of that wealth will come to him. But what he has not bargained for is that the king knows a lot about want, about need, about wealth. And his ambition, his imagination, his vision is larger than that of the hunter. And it includes the hunter in his desires. The hunter thinks he's a waiter serving this king. But when you're serving a power like that, you end up being the meal, perhaps. You end up being the dinner served to others. For the king sees not just the Firebird, but all things, perhaps, as things he can acquire if he chooses to do so. So he reports back to base, the hunter does. He gets to the headquarters, he brings the feather there, and again, the king has this larger vision. And we can praise him for that, right? Kings are large, that's what it's all about. There are small kings, I suppose, but just by definition, the king is someone who's got the larger vision. So though the king in this story is something of a evil king, toxic in many ways, if I can use that word, he does have the vision, and he calls these things to him, to his realm of stone and of rules and gold in boxes. He seeks out these other forces, among them the Firebird. So the hunter hasn't bargained for that. Does that happen in life? I think it does. You make a deal. I make a deal with the Russians, with the Democrats, with the Republicans, with the Union of Concerned Scientists who eat clams and play poker on Thursday nights when the moon is green. We make a deal with these forces, not realizing that we are a part of that deal in a deeper way than we anticipate. That we perhaps are a substance to be dealt with and packaged and claimed as much as anything else that this king, this other force, wants. So the hunter set off to get something else, get the Firebird, and he accomplishes that through the wisdom of his horse and the grain on the floor, and brings it back. So we've got the realms of fire and of air in some degree because of the bird, and then he's sent off to go to the edge of the world. Now we could say, do we like kings in this story, in the world? Do we like them? Are they evil or are they not? Do we need them? Some would say, can't the hunter just split? I mean, he's got a good horse, a wise and magical horse, it seems. Can he just get on that horse and leave? Well, that's a tempting idea. And I like that idea too. I've been tempted by it, of course. Let's get out of here. We don't need this king. But is that really possible? The dream of this story, if the story can be said to be wrestling with, to thinking out, to figuring out something, the story does not leave the realm of the king for long. The story recognizes that is crucial to the landscape of the story, to have the king there, mean though he is, demanding though he is. And I think that's a pretty true realization. If the hunter were to go off somewhere, what would he build? What would he create? Would he create a kingdom just like that of the king? He's someone who wants things clearly as the king does. He picked up that feather because he hoped to be rewarded. Would he just become another king, another evil emperor, demanding another hunter to bring him stuff? Should we mention the French Revolution? Sure, let's mention the French Revolution. We're done with kings. Forget it. Yes, we don't need kings anymore, all this nobility stuff. And then what do you get? You get chaos, you get the guillotine, you get bloodshed, and you get Napoleon, who comes and doesn't want just the feather, but wants the whole bird. I don't want France. Let's try all of Europe. Why not? Let's try Russia. Yes, let's attack Russia. Napoleon, that historical figure, he has the vision of going beyond the borders of France. It wasn't enough just to get rid of the king. We need a new empire for us. Have we seen this pattern before? I think we have. We see it around us. It's in the world, and that's why it's in the story. What needs to happen for there to be a good king? Can we do without kings? I don't really have an answer to that. Certainly in the psyche, if this story can be seen as a soul, as an individual personality, the king is the principle which decides things and is the ruling, gives order to the universe of the self. Now, is it a bad king? Can he be made better? Well, that's what the story will try to find out. But if the hunter were to split and to head for somewhere else, to leave New York City and go out to Iowa, to go to Hungary, to go to Thailand, would he not bring that king-like impulse with him? Would he not bring that arrogance and that urge to acquire things with him? So that Thailand, or wherever, would become just another possession, like the Firebird itself is a possession, not a wild, free thing, but something to be brought to the king. So the story seems to say that this problem needs to be solved in a different way. And then we get the sea, which it seems like once it comes, to me anyway, it feels like we've been waiting for it the whole time. We've had this king who has no queen. We've had the hunter who also, where there's no lady in his life as far as we know. There's no sort of feminine principle. We need some balance here, people. So we go to the sea, and there we find water. And there we find Vasilisa the Beautiful, living wild and free, perhaps, in her golden boat on the waves. It's a beautiful scene. So it seems like she's been necessary to this story. And then the hunter makes of himself the bait. Like before, he spread out the grain to lure the Firebird there to the field. Now he is himself the beautiful thing. So in a way, this is kind of a step forward, right? Because he has made himself beautiful to lure her there, which seems like a good thing. And she comes, and they sing and tell their stories, and then he does the horrible thing. The moment which I, as a storyteller, am tempted to say, I'm cutting that out. I don't like that moment. Let's change this story. But to change the story would be a dangerous thing. It's been told this way for hundreds, if not thousands of years. I don't think the hunter's ready to do anything but what he does, which is date rape, basically. Gets her drunk and takes her away to the king. And not even, really, because he doesn't even satisfy his own desire. He's serving the boss. So it's a horrible thing for Vasilisa, of course, to be dragged away to the king. And it would be equally horrible if the hunter took her away to his own little bungalow in the mountains. But from the hunter's point of view, that would be a little bit of a development. That would be a sign of evolution, to think not just of the boss, but to think of his own desires in a way. Hey, I have desires too. I like that Firebird. I want a Firebird of my own. So again, that would be an oppressive, arrogant, horrible thing to do to Vasilisa, but it would be a little bit of a step forward, I would think, for the hunter. But he's not even there. He's still serving the boss, the headquarters. So after this lovely scene with song and music and the wine, he takes her back to the boss, the king, and places her at his feet. And it's interesting to think about choice in this story. As I said earlier, who has any choices at all? The hunter chooses to pick up that feather. Vasilisa has had no choices in the story. Now, she's just come into the story, but so far she's done nothing except be taken from the wild, beautiful element she was in, where she was at home, which is the sea, and been brought to the king. But now she has a moment where she can do have a little bit of a choice and decide something. And what she brings to the table is a counter demand. Yes, I will marry you, king. She sees where she is. Is she magical? Is she a goddess? It's hard to say. She kind of has that feeling to me because of the golden boat, because of her connection to the sea. Vasilisa at the edge of the world. The edge of the world, the world being the place of the Dow Jones Average and the New York Times and the email messages, the human place. But out there's the edge of the world. She comes from the edge. And now in that kingdom, now that she's brought to the center of the human world, she makes a demand, which is, I want the wedding dress. And the king knows how to deal with this. You get the hunter to do it, of course. That's how you do this. The king, for his part, well, how could he respond? He could be more enlightened. He could say, well, I'm going to get you that dress myself. Because if you're going to be the woman of my heart, I need to go the distance. That's what the king could say. Also, to back up for a moment, the hunter at the sea, what would be the most enlightened thing he could do? Well, he could ask Vasilisa. He could say, dear lady, I've been sent here by the king. This is a situation, but I respect you as being with your own desires and volition and a need to flourish in the world. How can we solve this? What can the two of us do to get out of this? That would be the best thing, would it not? Anyway, so he takes Vasilisa back to the king. And the king wants to fulfill Vasilisa's demand, which is to go get the dress, and so off the hunter goes, again returning to the realm of water. And once there, I can really feel the depth of it, right? We've been horizontal so far, back and forth, to the forest, back to the castle, back to the forest, back to the castle. And now suddenly we have this movement down. I can feel it in my body, like how is he possibly going to get there? Under a rock at the bottom of the sea. It's beautiful and it's kind of scary. But the horse solves it, and we've got the crabs. These lovely crabs. The crab who lives in two worlds, right? Who lives in the watery element and in the earthy element as well. There's another story I've told on my website, a Haitian story called The Name. And in that story, there's a crab who is sort of like a shaman because he crosses the two worlds. He joins the two. He can heal the situation because of his knowledge of those two realms and the fact that he can go and move about in both of those places, the watery element and the earth, the sand. So the crabs save the day and bring the dress there, and they go back to the king. Beautiful moment, that beautiful dress. My friend, the storyteller Walton Stanley, has pointed out that jujitsu happens there when Vasilisa, who's put under these demands, makes a counter demand. And the horse counsels the hunter to do the same earlier. You have to do this, have to get Vasilisa, you have to get the bird, but you can make a counter demand of the king. It's a way of using that force of demand and requirement on your side, I suppose, as opposed to just being subject to it. So then Vasilisa does this amazing thing, and she requires a cauldron of water. Now, as I said before, is she a goddess? Is she a human woman? Well, it's hard to say. If she's a human woman, maybe she's just angry, right? That guy dragged me here from my home. I want that guy dead. That's totally understandable, right? For me, though, I feel something magical about her and some kind of wisdom in her. And the wisdom is so key. It's beautiful, right? We've had these elements of fire in the Firebird and water in the sea, and now they're going to be brought together. Water and fire forcibly brought together, combined in this way. And that's when we get transformation. That's when we get the alchemy of these two forces, opposing forces. The water which can put out the fire which can burn and boil away the water and melt the ice. These two contrasting and opposing forces are brought together, smack, right there. And Vasilisa is the one who has the insight to see that transformation is required and that this is how it's going to happen. So she calls for that cauldron, and it is brought in with the timbers beneath it burning and with the water boiling. And then we get this great moment. Now, I have to say, in my 20s, when I heard this story, it was the Firebird which attracted me. I was playing rock and roll at 2 a.m. in bars and coming home smelling like an ashtray. I was living out my dream, I suppose you could say. Now I'm older, time has passed, I have a family, I've got a house, a wife, and a daughter, and so the cauldron is what calls to me. And the way in which it is solved by the hunter leaping into that cauldron. I'm going to get totally real here with you. I think of this a lot over the past, since I ever heard this story. This moment has stuck with me. I think of it when doing chores, the chores we have to do, doing the taxes, the dishes, making dinner, doing the laundry. Do I choose to do those, or am I sort of dragged into them? The taxes. I mean, there's the things I want to do, and there's the things I have to do. We all have those. If I just play guitar and read a book, if I check my email, if I do the things I want to do for fun, and I don't do the things I'm required to do, then I hit the wall. You know, April 14th comes, and it's like taxes are due tomorrow. I got to do them now. And so I'm dragged into that cauldron and cast in, and I am not transformed, right? This happens with the smallest things. Doing the dishes. Do I do that now, or no? I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna read this book. I'm gonna play this song. I'm gonna go for a walk. And then you come back and you have to do the dishes, basically, because there's no spoons or something like that. So in that way, I feel that transformation, to choose your fate. It seems like a small thing, but it's actually the biggest thing in the world. Because then I am transformed. I'm not doing those taxes up to the deadline, hating it inside, just, rebelling against the whole thing. Taxes are dumb, they're stupid, why did I wait so long, this is horrible. Instead, I've chosen them. Maybe on April 1st, maybe before then, maybe in February I've done my taxes. Whoa, January, imagine that. I've leapt into that cauldron of my own free will. And that changes everything. So the hunter does that, and he is transformed. He emerges glowing and dripping and changed in that big way. And then the king goes in. The king, who does not really leap in. He's taken there by his servants. The evil king who must be transformed or killed. Do we like kings in stories? Do we like them? Do we like having them there? Well, we do and we don't, I would say. Do we like them in the world? We do and we don't, I would say. There are evil kings. There's people, many of us, I think, would recall and say are evil kings. Prime ministers, presidents, politicians, whoever you want to name. People who abuse their power. Right now, corporations are the ones, I suppose, that many people I know rag on the most. ExxonMobil, whatever. They do what they want, and they don't care. They trash the planet. They screw over people's lives. Do they double hull their oil tankers? No, because that would be a lot of money. Instead, they wait for an oil spill, and they pay the fine, and they pretend to clean it up, because that's cheaper than actually double hulling all the tankers, which would ensure that this kind of thing doesn't happen. So we criticize the corporations for ruining the planet and our lives. And they deserve that criticism, I would say, in my opinion. Most of the time they do. But nevertheless, we as individuals aspire to the condition of corporations. We as individuals aspire to the condition of a corporation. We want to be free to do what we want. We want to have the toys we want to have. We want to drive our cars wherever. We want to eat whatever we want. We want strawberries in January. We want a gas stove. We want a new toy from the Apple Computer Company. So that king, that hungry king, is in some ways ourselves, that evil king. And we don't change that king by leaving and going somewhere else, because then we would set up another empire, which would be as evil as the one we just left, probably. Instead, we get the transformation, which is called into the story by Vasilisa. And the hunter is transformed, and the king, well, he's transformed too, I suppose. And his transformation is to be killed. That old energy in the psyche and the soul must go. This whole story seems a wrestling with limits and with choices. And does anybody in this story have a choice? We come to this story and it seems like a wild and free landscape. Firebird and the ocean and Vassilis at the edge of the world, kings and castles. But in fact, it's a world as limited, or perhaps more so, than our own. So what freedom do these characters have? Houdini, right? Bound by ropes. When there's slack in the rope, we say there's play in those ropes. He would clench his muscles to make them kind of tight there, and they would tie him up. And then afterwards, when he relaxed, fascinating, when he relaxed, there would be room there. There would be play in the ropes. That's what we call it. And he could use that play to get himself free. That whole thing, that's an amazing story, isn't it? Just that little piece, tensing and then relaxing. When you relax, there is freedom. But you need to tense first to make that freedom possible. I don't know what that means, but it's kind of great. And then there's play in the ropes. In the same way, is there play in our daily lives? Is there play in a week we spend on this earth? I love that play is how we get that freedom. So in this story, there are these demands put on the characters, but often they find a way to find a little room in there where something can happen. Vasilisa, why doesn't she just split when the king dies? Well, I don't know. But she chooses the hunter. Perhaps that's what she wants. I mean, in the human kind of realm, can she stay on the ocean forever? Maybe that's where she should be. Maybe she should marry some ocean spirit. Maybe she doesn't need to marry anybody, and she can just be out there wild and free. Well, that's very possible, and I think in the world that does exist. But at the same time, this is a story which started with a castle. It's kind of about the castle and what happens there. And the castle needs a lady. It seems to me, regardless of gender, it needs those principles of darkness and light, of those two sides. In any event, they are married. And that's what happens. Here's a poem for you. It's called, it's a poem by Alden Nolan, a Canadian poet. And he's deceased, been so for a while. 20th century poet, we can say. And this poem is called A Tiger in the Dublin Zoo. Here you go. It's coming at you. Know that I am Napoleon, the great, the magnificent tiger. Observe how an emperor takes possession of the ground on which he stands, imposes his own order on the space around him. I walk to and fro and am never halted. I stop and turn where I choose, and that is 3 feet short of the end of the cage. No more and no less. Never once have I forgotten myself and been stopped by the bars. I am Napoleon, the great, the magnificent tiger. There it is. The tiger chooses to stop. He chooses to do his taxes in January, and in that way he's free, if I can take it into that realm. I'm going to read that again. Poems go by kind of short, but they're reusable. This is Alden Nolan again, Nowlan. It's from a book called What Happened When He Went to the Store for Bread. His poems, all by Alden Nolan, chosen and introduced by Thomas R. Smith, a wonderful poet from Wisconsin. Here's the poem. A Tiger in the Dublin Zoo. Know that I am Napoleon, the great, the magnificent tiger. Observe how an emperor takes possession of the ground on which he stands, imposes his own order on the space around him. I walk to and fro and am never halted. I stop and turn where I choose, and that is 3 feet short of the end of the cage. No more and no less. Never once have I forgotten myself and been stopped by the bars. I am Napoleon, the great, the magnificent tiger. Beautiful. I stop and turn where I choose, he says. By recognizing the limits, this tiger becomes an emperor. By recognizing the limits around him, around us, around her, around us, we can become the ones who are in charge of their destiny in some way. We aspire to total freedom, right? Forever. Oh, yes, whatever I want all the time. But maybe that looks more like ExxonMobil, more like a dictatorship than it looks like, people dancing in a field. because limits are in this world. We have bodies we need to eat, and so we get a job, and that job is in a nation, and there are armies, and there are presidents, and there are kings and prime ministers, and there's guns in the ground, and guns in the armory there, and battleships on the sea. So we live in a world of limits. And this story, I see more and more, gives us tools for dealing with those limits, and how we can sing in our chains, how we can flourish despite, but not even despite, how we can flourish because of those limits, which perhaps help us flourish in some way we cannot conceive of. Thank you for listening to this story and exploring it with me. If you've got ideas about it, I'd love to hear them. You can send them to me at email. Yes, leemingjay@gmail.com. Leemingjay@gmail.com. There are more stories on my website, of course. If you are able to support this adventure of getting stories out into the world, please do so. You can do that by Patreon. That's a great way to do that. I have a Patreon account. You can find it through my website or search on Patreon. Getting the stories out into the world, well, they are already there. The prime ministers, the presidents, the evil kings, the Vasilisas of this world, the hunters are out there. They're on your street. They are us, perhaps. But nevertheless, the stories help us to see them. The stories give us maps, give us the deepened awareness so we can recognize them in our lives. And when that cauldron is brought to us, which looks probably nothing like a cauldron to us right now, we can choose to be dragged or to leap. And may we have the wisdom to leap, so that we may flourish and the world may flourish as well. Thank you for listening to this, and take care.